And then we'll get started with our sponsor video. Welcome to everyone. And as people join in, they will join the conversation. So I'll ask that everybody mute and then use the chat for questions as we go along. What we'll do is we'll first introduce our sponsors. We're really grateful to Huntington Bank and Delta Dental for sponsoring the Civility Project very generously so that it comes free to all of our hosting organizations and our attendees. And so we do have a quick little video from Delta Dental that I'd like to share that shows a little bit about why they sponsor.
We are living in challenging times. Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening. And families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project.
So we're really grateful to our sponsors for making this possible. We're grateful to Trinity Health for sponsoring today, and for all of you for showing up in the middle of a workday to be with us. What I'd like to do is introduce Stephen Henderson and Nolan Finley, who are the founders of the Civility Project. And they're basically the energy behind it and the idea driving it. And so I thought we could start with them just introducing themselves and how the Civility Project came to be.
You going or me first? No.
You go, Steve.
All right. So I'm Stephen Henderson. You may know me from the many different media roles I play around Southeast Michigan, including as the host of Detroit Today on WDET and American Black Journal on Detroit Public Television. The Civility Project is something that I started with my friend and nemesis, Nolan Finley, a few years ago. I say nemesis because when I moved back to Detroit in the late 2000s, I was the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press, and Nolan had been the editorial page editor of the Detroit News at that point for about 10 years. And so there was a natural, I think, opposition that existed between us in the sense that he was the editorial page editor of the very conservative newspaper in town, and I was the editorial page editor of the liberal paper. Lots of people liked to kind of feature that opposition, though. They liked to kind of throw us together in various different formats, debates or panels or television shows, and kind of watch us go at it. And we were pretty good at that because we do disagree on lots of things. You could throw just about any issue out in front of the two of us and come up with two very different approaches to it and two different takes on it. And so we could debate, we could argue, we could even fight. And it was a kind of predictable way of featuring, two sides of any issue. But, one of the things that happened as Nolan and I were more and more frequently finding ourselves together in these situations was that we started to kind of talk to each other and learn about each other. Against many odds, I think, we actually became friends. And so it wasn't just that we could get together and argue or debate. We also started to get together and do some other things that weren't about the things that we disagreed about or weren't about division. It was really interesting when that happened to see the kind of reaction that people in both of our worlds, I think, had to that. I think even today, lots of people don't quite understand what that friendship is about, or how it survives, or why. The Civility Project, I think, though, is best described as our attempt to explain that relationship, to explain how we're able to be friends, but also bitter opponents in some cases, when we're talking about politics or culture, or any of the issues that kind of roil the nation right now. That became an even more important relationship to highlight, though, I think, in the last 5 years or so, as the normal discourse, the normal political discourse, the normal cultural discourse has become much more bitter and much angrier, and fewer people who disagree about political or cultural things are able to have any kind of relationship with one another. Even inside families, I think we're seeing increasingly that people just can't figure out how to get past their disagreements, agree on ways to disagree, but maintain an overall relationship that doesn't reflect the bad feelings that people might have about issues. And so about 4 years ago, we started getting together with groups like this, and in front of lots of other people to talk about ways to do that. And we call it the Civility Project because we believe that civility is one of the kind of key ingredients to democracy, that in order for us to be able to govern ourselves together as a whole, with many different parts who believe different things, we've got to have a common vehicle to be able to talk about the things that we don't agree on and to sort through our problems. That doesn't mean that any of us have to drop the things that we believe, or step away from them, or give them up in order to get along with people who don't agree with us. But it does mean that we have to be able to have those conversations without coming to blows. I think we have seen how extremes of that division have played out. No place more evidently than on January 6th, when a riotous mob attacked the U.S. Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power that's happened in this country for 243 years. We really have gotten to the point where there are some people who just can't accept that that the civil discourses, that the civil institutions of our democracy are the way that we need to do things, and they are resorting to other kinds of tactics. And so the Civility Project is an effort for us to talk to people, especially here in Southeast Michigan, but really all over the country, about ways to preserve those civil institutions, ways to figure out how to talk to people you don't agree with, and to do it in the spaces that you have control over. None of us could have stopped what happened on January 6th in Washington, for instance. None of us has the power to make those people think differently, or to stop them from doing what they're doing. But about your neighborhood, or think about your church, or think about your school, or your workplace, the places that you interact with people all the time. That's what we're talking about. How do you relate and interact with people that you don't agree with in a way that that is civil and doesn't look like what we saw on January 6th, and preserves both the integrity of the disagreement. We love disagreement. Noel and I really do thrive on the idea that we disagree and we get after each other. And sometimes there are real passions that come out, but it never goes to the point of destroying the civil discourse between us, the institution of that civil relationship that we have.
Yeah, excuse me. Thanks, Steve. And I think that's a good summation of what the Civility Project is all about. There's no question that as a people, we are rushing toward an irredeemable divide based on our political beliefs, our individual ideology. Before the last election, I saw a poll, 74% of Americans said they don't have a friend who doesn't think like them politically. And so, meaning they don't talk on a regular basis to people on the other side of this political divide. And if we don't talk to other people who have beliefs that are different than ours, who are on the other side, if you will, we have no hope of closing the gap enough that we can work together to find pragmatic solutions to our problems. You see that unfolding in Washington this week as they're deadlocked over spending policy and taxes, et cetera. This happens on and on in our political halls, where consensus and compromise has given away to, gosh, whoever's in power is going to get total, their total control and going to get their way completely. This idea of consensus building is just gone. So what we try to do, our basic tenet of the Civility Project is that we have to talk to each other. We have to talk to each other in a respectful manner. Screaming at each other, there's a time and place for that, I guess, but it doesn't lead to understanding. And that's what we're trying to do here. Our basic principle is that all good people come to their opinions the same way. They take the facts and the information available to them, apply their own experiences and values, and come up with an opinion. And before you start talking to someone across or who's on the other side of this political divide, it's important to understand the values and experience that have gone into them forming their opinion. Just because someone holds a different opinion than you doesn't make them evil or stupid or that they're trying to ruin the country. And that's too often what we default to, instead of trying to come to some sort of understanding of what drives and motivates that opinion. And so we generally start our in-person civility sessions, and we're going to get back to those, I think, very, very quickly, hopefully. But before we start our in-person sessions, we ask people to sit down, to couple up with, like Steve and I did, and just talk about the other person's experience or each other's experience. Talk about the values, talk about why you hold liberal views or conservative views. And Steve and I did that for NPR when they brought their StoryCorps lab to Detroit, their StoryCorps trade. We sat down and did that. It was very, very useful to us because we had known each other a long time by then, had a lot of difficult conversations, a lot of arguments, but I don't think we really understood what was motivating our core beliefs. I think we just assumed, well, they're a conservative or he's a conservative, he's a liberal, whatever, without getting into the bottom of that. And we found it to be a very useful exercise in taking some of the heat out of our discussions. And taking away some of the bad assumptions that we had about why the other felt the way he did. And so, that's what we're trying to do, trying to encourage people to do. And, we find it a very useful exercise.
Thanks for that introduction, guys. I really appreciate it. For everybody who's come as Stephen and Nolan were speaking, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We usually weave them into the program as we go along. So I'd love to hear from you. So guys, I guess that's a great foundation for understanding what we're doing here, why you're seeking to share these ideas with people. And I did put the link to your StoryCorps conversation in the chat if anybody wants to check it out. But where can people start? It feels a little overwhelming sometimes to think, we have such big divides, and when we hear what's happening in Congress right now, and yet, the majority of Americans support the legislation, but the politicians don't, it can feel a little overwhelming and maybe helpless. So where do people start in their daily lives to move the needle a little bit? You know, where do we begin?
Well, it has to be important to you. You have to see some value in having a broader group of acquaintances or friends or relationships so that you're not simply in an echo chamber where everybody you talk to shares your views. I mean, that leads to a smugness and a comfortableness, I guess, that we really shouldn't have. I mean, we should be challenging ourselves. We should be challenging our views, and the ways that's part of why this relationship has worked so well for Steve and I, because we can sharpen our own views by understanding better what the opposing views are. And so, rather than getting into this comfortable place where we just absolutely assume we're right and the other person is wrong, we've got to find value in trying to understand, trying to hear at least other opinions.
We talk a lot about the idea that this is something about that is fundamentally about your own personal spaces, the different spaces that you live in, and thinking about how to improve those spaces. I mean, how many of us have neighborhoods or neighbors who we don't feel comfortable talking to because they think differently than we do? How often do you come across somebody at work or in church who you don't feel like you can have a political conversation with, or in your own family? How many of us have that uncle who you hope doesn't show up for holidays anymore because you can't talk about politics with that person? That is the beginning point, I think, for this whole idea of civility. Identify the places where you can actually make this difference for you. I think right now the world is really overwhelming. There are so many things going on, so many super crazy things happening, and most of them feature this idea of not getting along and not being able to get along. This week, you've got this effort in Congress to get some pretty progressive legislation passed, and the coverage has the entire week been about what they call the whip count, which is when a political party has a vote. They're trying to make sure that their members get to the vote casting stage and cast it the right way. The whole narrative is about how divided they are, and whether they're going to get to the point of resolving the fight. It hasn't been about the substance of the legislation that they're talking about and what it would actually do. That, I think, leads to a really defeatist kind of feeling among a lot of citizens, that there's just nothing you can do to get past those kinds of obstacles. But if you think about it more in terms of your own world and the places that you go and the people you interact with on a daily or a weekly basis, and think about ways to improve the ability to talk about difficult things in those spaces, it all seems a lot more manageable. It all seems a lot more solvable. And I think if you start there, you can be a lot more optimistic about what's possible.
And that's a good example, Steve, what's going on with these key pieces of legislation. I mean, the president was asked about his $3.5 trillion spending plan and what it was all about. And his answer was one word: victory. Well, that shouldn't be what it's all about. It should be deciding what's the best policies at this moment for the American people and all of the American people. And that's why we have a representative government. There should have been more discussion, more debate, more give and take. And today it's all about, we judge the effectiveness of our lawmakers by political victories rather than victories for policy and people. And I think in our own personal interactions, when we engage with someone in a conversation, our goal should not be winning. Our goal should not be beating the other person into the dust so we can walk away and say, well, boy, I really scored points on him or her. I mean, we should set an honest goal for our conversations. You know, we want to have the give and take. We want to listen and hear what the other person has to say so that we might learn. And we want them to listen to hear us. And too often we go into these conversations, Steve, and we don't listen one bit.
So how does social media play into all of this? You know, we're saying, okay, let's do this, what seems like an impossible thing. And then so many of us are dipping into our social media accounts throughout the day where it feels like it's even a louder echo chamber or a quieter echo chamber, and the arguments are more fierce. So how do we navigate that?
So, you know, I'm a big fan of social media as a tool for, you know, staying connected with people, and certainly as a tool for, you know, keeping up on what's going on. I use Facebook and Twitter, and to a lesser extent, Instagram as news feeds. It's how I find out the things that are actually happening. At the same time, the nature of social media really makes it harder, I think, to maintain, you know, civil social circles that are politically diverse or culturally diverse. You know, there is this sort of echo chamber effect where we are all choosing the spaces that we want to operate in, and the research says that most of us are choosing according to our politics and excluding people who don't agree with us from those circles. And then there is this weird dynamic of the interactions on social media that reinforces the idea of shutting people out, blocking people, gagging people, or muting people. And it's not just that you do those things. If you notice, no one ever blocks somebody and doesn't tell everybody else that they did it, right? And you get these great cheers and applause. I blocked this person, never talking to that person again. That reinforces this idea that we are so divided that we can't deal with people, or that we shouldn't, and that we ought to be applauded for pushing the people that we don't agree with away from us and out of our circles. And so, you know, that part of social media, I think, is an accelerant for the degradation of these civil institutions that we're talking about, and the idea of relationship building that's really, really key. The idea of that civil discourse. If you can simply mute somebody, if you can simply block somebody or unfriend them with a click of a mouse, it makes it really easy, much easier to get rid of somebody than it does to kind of work through the idea of what your differences are and being able to respect those.
I think social media is an abomination. I try to use it less and less. I mean, when you think about its potential to connect and to encourage and to foster great conversations, it certainly hasn't delivered on that potential. Most often, you rarely see a tweet that says, well, I read your opinion, I disagree with it, and here's why for, you know, these 3 points. What think you? And that sort of intellectual back and forth. Mostly what you see is, you're an idiot, you're a moron, you ought to be drowned, or something of that nature, something really hateful. If you go on your Twitter feed right now, count the number of positive messages you read, count the number of attaboys you read versus the number of, oh, you idiots you read. It is really uncivil discourse, and crude discourse. It's just not, I don't think it's healthy for our society. And, you know, people are sitting there at home talking with someone electronically miles away or across the country and saying the most vile things to each other, things they wouldn't say if they were face to face. I would hope they wouldn't say. And I think we all have a responsibility to mind our social media behavior, language, discourse, because it more than anything else is fueling this bitterness we have toward each other.
Yeah. So Jen, thank you for your question in the chat. And please, anybody who has questions for Stephen and Nolan, add them to the chat so we can get them in. Jen asked, in conversations, I hear people saying that someone ought to care more about a certain topic. There's so many injustices in the world. How can we make it less overwhelming and easier to participate in productive dialogue?
Well, I mean, everybody cares about something, and some things you care more about than others. And I think we all have our passions, and we should, again, go back to understanding the reason somebody might be more passionate about an issue, one issue, than the other. I mean, things that happen in the world affect us all in different ways, and I think it's a little bit unfair to expect everybody to feel the same fire about an issue that you feel. And when you stop and consider, do you feel the same fire about their issues that they feel? I mean, that's why it's important to have these informative conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters. You know, it matters more when it's something that I think you can do something about, right? I mean, again, where are the opportunities for you to actually make something different, not just for yourself, but maybe for your neighbors, your family, or your church or your school. I think there's so much that encourages us to prioritize outrage without action right now. The idea that it's okay just to be mad, it's just okay just to be horrified, and to feed into the idea that that people who are that people who are doing the things that you're reading about are the enemy, or they're just horrible people. I think pulling away from that and thinking about, well, what are the issues where I live? What are the issues that I live around and with? It leads you to a less frenzied and frustrating interaction with news. And listen, I agree. There are so many things that are horrifying right now. There are so many things that are terrifying in the news. I mean, we just lived through a once in a century pandemic where I think everybody lost something. This is a very unusual time, and it is overwhelming. And again, I think pulling it back to the familiar and controllable is an important way not to just lose your mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea that we can't simply disagree. We have to snuff out that that dissenting opinion. Someone doesn't agree with us or with what we think is the a generally accepted opinion. We have to drive them out of the public square. And this whole idea of canceling dissent or setting these arbitrary standards for what can be said and what can't be said, or digging back 30 years into somebody's closet and say, look what he or she said then or wrote then, denying this whole idea of evolving opinions or even redemption, I think is very, very unhealthy. But it's not like we just want to prevail in our arguments. We don't even want to have the arguments. We want to silence the other side. And I don't think that's getting us anywhere. And it's cutting off this process that's required to reach pragmatic solutions. And that is vigorous debates. And it's sometimes a very painful process, but it's a process we have to commit to.
You know, it's interesting, Stephen, you said something about how it's okay to just be angry. And that's a really interesting point, because it seems like that's true not only on social media, but just across America, even our leaders down to everyday folks, which of course makes me think about, well, what's the point of all this? You know, why should we build civility, and why should we, you know, tamp down our anger, and what are we all working toward? I wonder if we've lost sight of that. And then at the same time, you know, we're just all everyday people, and we're saying, okay, we should work really hard to build civility. And it can sometimes feel like, well, I'm just the little guy down here. How is that going to move the needle or make change at the larger level when I'm watching these horrific things happening on a national scale? So how do we process that? And how do we understand this whole anger situation too?
Well, I think it's okay to be angry. You know, I'm angry about the people that we lost in the pandemic. You know, 15 of whom were people that I actually knew and knew well. You know, some 40 of whom were people that I just kind of knew. And I think it's okay to be angry about that. I think you have to be angry about it. I'm angry about what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, and how much that scares me. Not just me individually, but you know, scares me about the two brown-skinned children that I helped bring into the world, and who are becoming adults and starting to interact with authorities and people like that. And I think it's okay to be angry about that. I think it's okay to be very, very angry and scared about that. Again, I think the question is, what do you do about it? And we've lost, because we've lost so many of the civil institutions, or they're so badly damaged and degraded, there are fewer opportunities for people to figure out how to channel that anger in a direction that matters, that makes a difference. There are solutions to some of these things. You know, the pandemic wasn't something we could, quote unquote, solve. It was something that should have inspired a collective spirit among us, to fight a common enemy, instead of find ways to make enemies out of the people who we disagreed with about how to fight it. I think at another time, there's no question that would have happened much easier. You know, there've been a lot of comparisons between the pandemic and the response among Americans to that, and World War II, and the response by Americans to this call to work together, to build the collective spirit to fight a common enemy. We don't have the leaders that we need to call us to those things, and we don't have the institutions anymore that allow us to make change. And so again, I think building those institutions, rebuilding those institutions, starts with each of us doing more of that in the spaces that we have access to and have some control over. Build a common spirit with the people in your world, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, whether they are Black or white or Latino, whether they are Christians or Muslims or Hindu. Repairing that is the first step, to me, to being able to direct your anger in a place and add something that makes a difference, and not just for you, but for your community.
But you can't live an angry life. You know, and you can't let anger consume you. You just get one shot at this, and there's so much joy and beauty in the world. If you can't see past your anger, it's not a healthy thing. I've got a friend who just boils with anger over the political situation. You can't sit down with him without him launching into a very angry diatribe about the things he thinks is wrong with our political structure. And it's come to the point where he's driving away the people who love him. People just don't want to be around him. And they don't, they don't want to hear all this all the time. And, I always think in 10 years and 20 years, are these issues we're so angry about today, are they going to, most of them, are they going to be relevant still? Are they going to matter? But those relationships you're destroying will matter. And I just worry he'll look back someday and say, the things that were really important in life, I allowed my anger to destroy.
Really good points. Thank you, guys. So we have a couple of great questions in the chat. And I do encourage anybody to share their question in there, because that's how we'll be addressing it in the next remaining 20 minutes. So Ariana said, my family and I don't agree politically. We generally just don't talk politics. However, social media is a challenge. I will post something about a mentor or hero, and then a family member will respond negatively based on politics. I ignore it, but then my friends start attacking my family on social media. Any tips for how to calm the fires on social media posts to keep the peace between those who disagree politically? I'll just jump in before you guys answer, and I'll say, you can choose who gets to see your posts. So I can put in the chat how to do that. But anyway, go ahead, guys.
Well, don't fight with your family on social media. I mean, that's a good place to start. I mean, it always surprises me when an old friend or somebody, I've worked with very closely, or someone I've even done things for, will post something very vile about a piece of my work on Twitter or on social media. I'm like, did you forget we were friends, for God's sakes? I mean, is it more important to have all these likes because you gave a zinger out to somebody than it is to maintain a friendship? Decide what's important.
Stephen, anything on that?
Yeah, no, I think, again, social media is, it's an infant in it's social development, and it encourages such bad behavior that some things are not worth trying to do there. Having nuanced or complex discussions about really complicated issues is not really its strength. I think it could be. I think, over time, I hope that it will develop into that, because the genius of social media is the instantaneous nature of communication, and the ability to build connections with people. I mean, that was sort of how it started. It's devolved into this ugly place where people just try to take each other down. But I think over time that it will end up being a real strength, a tool of civil society. I think it's going to take a long time for that to be true. And in the meantime, maybe just take your post down, or don't allow family to post comments on it.
Hey, Steve, I have a friend who keeps a sticky note taped to her computer. It says, before she types, she looks at it every time before she types. It says, does this need to be said? Does this need to be said right now? And does this need to be said by me? And that's pretty good guidance, because we say a lot of things on social media we would never say face to face.
Yes, absolutely we do.
So Jennifer said, what if someone has an opinion that is inherently against individual rights? What if someone says, quote, Black people should be separate but equal space, or quote, you should be able to deny employment to transgender people, unquote. I don't think it's okay to agree to disagree in these cases. How then can you stay civil when you have these sorts of differences of opinion?
Well, I have said many times that I think there's a limit to the idea of civil discourse, and there are some ideas that are themselves uncivil, and it's okay to point those out, right? Opinions that assign lesser humanity or equal rights protection to others are not civil, and so that's not a great example of the kind of discourse that we're trying to encourage. And there are times when you just have to say, look, I cannot talk to this person because they don't see me as an equal in that way. They can't accept the equality of my humanity or my citizenship. I don't think that's most people. I think that is an increasingly smaller and smaller minority. I also think there's a danger that we assign that kind of point of view to people who really just disagree with us about policy.
Good point.
And that's, you got to be very careful about that. I think that is also not productive. But you know, I had a conversation today about about the things that are hung up in Congress, for instance, right now. One of them is this George Floyd Community Policing Act, I think is what it's called. We still have a voting rights issue that is hung up in Congress. And those arguments come right up to the edge, right, of these things that you're talking about, where there are people who just don't think African Americans and other populations deserve the same thing that everybody else has. But we were talking about how the history of this country has been that you've had some very significant strides in that regard. If you think about the 1960s, the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, those were considered impossibilities, political impossibilities, because of the opposition inside both the Democratic and the Republican parties. You had substantial minorities in both parties that just were not prepared to do that. And it would have been easy for the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, to say, I can't engage with these people because they're racist. And he would have been right. They were. Instead, what he said was, I need their votes, and I'm going to get their votes. Now, he did that any number of different ways, sometimes by convincing, sometimes by coaxing, and many times by threatening great political consequence if people didn't come along. But in the end, he got it done. I think the idea of pursuing change in the face of that kind of bigotry through civil discourse and civil institutions it's the lifeblood of the democracy that we live in, right? It is the way things are supposed to work. I think we're further away from that kind of thing now than we were in the 60s. But I do think you have to many times lean in to the idea that somebody who may appear to be a racist, or may be a racist, or may be a homophobe, is somebody who can be convinced, is someone who can be swayed to do the right thing. And if you write them off and say, I can't deal with them, then you lose that opportunity.
I would take just one different twist to that. I don't think if you enter a conversation with the goal of converting, you're going to go very far. The goal when you enter that sort of conversation is, maybe if you listen to that person, they'll listen to you, and maybe something you say can have an impact. But if you enter a conversation with this idea of conversion, you're always going to be frustrated. You're always going to be disappointed. I've been talking to Steve for years now, have not converted him to the light, but we keep talking. And Steve talked about Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights legislation. Lyndon Johnson was a president most people would have thought described as racist, and he said many racist things, and yet look what he did. And so, it's a complicated world, and people take positions and do things oftentimes you don't expect them to take or do because it's advantageous. It becomes advantageous to them. If people had given up on Lyndon Johnson in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, you wouldn't have had some of that landmark legislation Steve was talking about.
So we have a question. There are misconceptions about immigrants. How do we start a political conversation knowing that the other person cannot even look past the fact that you are an immigrant? So this is a really great time to talk about, who do we have these conversations with? Where do we begin?
Well, I mean, this is a nation of immigrants. We've had generation and generation of immigrants, and I know there's a lot of suspicion. There always has been from the beginning, but I don't know where we would have been in this country, without these waves of immigration that have kept our economy booming, our growth going, our innovation going. You look at the technology industry now, and how much of that, those innovations were developed by people who weren't born in this country but came here to live and work. And I think, hopefully we're starting to see. I mean, I welcome these Afghani refugees coming here, particularly to our metropolitan area, which is losing population. What a quick way to get a population boost of people looking for security and opportunity. I wish we could get them all.
I think the immigration question is getting worse and worse in this country, and the last 4 years, I think, have a lot to do with it. It's really interesting right now to watch what's going on in Texas with these Haitian migrants who are being, brutalized in some cases by authorities. They're being sent back to a nation where they face unimaginable dangers, both because of the natural disasters and the political upheaval there. And there is this broader sense that you hear in the reaction to it, that somehow these people aren't quite deserving enough to be Americans. Somehow they're not following the process, or they're this or that. But ultimately, the answer is they don't deserve this. At the same time, there's 60,000 undocumented Canadians living in the United States right now. You never hear a word about how they got here or
Right.
whether they are leaving. And you sure wouldn't see men on horses whipping them with the reins. I mean, that image alone should scare all of us. I mean, that conjures the image of sheriffs running after runaway slaves 170 years ago. I mean, how we're tolerating this right now is just beyond me. And so, I mean, I do think we're in a very bad place with regard to the way that we think of immigration and the way we think of immigrants. Again, it is the return to those civil institutions and the rebuilding of those civil institutions, beginning with our individual relationships, I think is the antidote to that. You don't think of it the same when you know someone who's an immigrant as you do when you just watch on TV people pouring across a border.
You can support immigration and not support the chaos at the border. Every country controls its border and tries to have some orderly system in place for who it lets in and when and how many. I mean, you and I just came back from Mackinac, where you have businesses that are just about to die because they can't get workers to fill their spots. That's a very powerful argument in support of immigration. Those businesses up there used to be able to get foreign workers under these H-1B visas from all over the world. The union started squawking. Obama limited those visas, and Trump limited them even more. And now we have American businesses going out of business for lack of workers. So I think there's a lot of people who support the economic argument of bringing in immigrants at all levels, at all economic levels, but would like to see them brought in an orderly fashion. And what's going on at the border, I don't think is good for anybody. I think it creates a lot of anti-immigrant hostility that might not otherwise be there.
Well, but again, back to my example, there are only certain people who ever get called out on the idea of how they get here. These 60,000 Canadians are here just as illegally as anybody else. Most of them open their visas, you know, and things like that.
And that's true. That's 60,000 Canadians. 75,000 people are crossing that southern border a week illegal. I mean, there's a difference in impact levels. I think everybody who's here should be here legally, and we should make it a lot easier for people to be here illegally, even those dastardly Canadians.
So in our final minutes, are there any last thoughts, Stephen and Nolan, that you'd like to offer about, okay, this is a lot of great information, a lot of inspiration. What do we do next? You know, where should we all go after we get off this call?
I would say if there's somebody who you've been avoiding having a conversation with because your political views don't align, take the time to sit down with them and not talk about politics, but talk about who they are and why they feel the way they feel, what shapes them, and see if that doesn't then make it easier to have a back and forth conversation, an honest conversation about politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, again, starting in those spaces that are closest to you, and identifying the opportunities to have a more civil discourse with somebody that you just don't agree with. Start with your family, go to your neighborhood, go to your church and your school, and start to think about it. And as Nolan said, I think the key is that relationship building. You got to be able to move to a space where you can have a difficult conversation. You know, part of the reason that Nolan and I are able to argue the way that we do and never just kind of walk away for good from the conversation is because we actually do have a relationship, and we value that exchange and that relationship more than the outcome of any one argument. But you have to get there. You can't start with the argument and build that. You have to start with the relationship and then move to the places where you can talk about things that are difficult and where conflict is likely to arise.
That's really great advice. So we want to thank everybody for being here today and Trinity Health for sponsoring this session. Also, another shout out to our sponsors, Huntington Bank and Delta Dental. I'm putting in the chat the link to our website. We have lots of events coming up, some of which are open to the public. If you're interested in having a more interactive session, we have one Monday starting at 6 p.m. our time. That's hosted by a community in Southern Arizona, actually. It's going to be an hour and a half, and there will be breakout sections, 2 breakout groups where you can have smaller group conversations and really explore some of the things that Nolan and Stephen are teaching. And there's others on there as well that you can register for. And if you have a group or community or organization where you'd like to host a civility session, you can always reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. And we are now booking in November and then into 2022 in person as well as Zoom. So we really appreciate you guys being here and listening to this important conversation. So we wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you. Been good to be with you all.
Thanks.